The music business is in serious trouble. Or is it? That depends on your perspective. Let's talk about it. From New York City, this is How to Fix the Music Business, and I'm your host, Jim McDermott. Hey, welcome to How to Fix the Music Business. Before we get started with this episode, a brief side note. If it was the old days, I would make you a mixtape of everything that I've been listening to lately. I'd sit down with a ballpoint pen and I'd write the name of every song and the artist who recorded it on the J card that went inside the cassette, and maybe I'd make some kind of weird illustration, and I would definitely come up with a cool name for the mixtape. But because this is 2016, I've created a Spotify playlist of all the weird shit that I've been listening to lately. If you're at all interested in hearing the music that I like and what I listen to on a daily basis, hop onto Spotify and search for the playlist title. And yes, this is a semi-autobiographical title for this playlist. Search for the playlist Snarky Record Company Asshole. That's right, Snarky Record Company Asshole. I'll warn you right now, this is nothing you want to listen to during your workout in the morning, your 7 a.m. workout at the gym. It's out there, weird, electronic, bizarre stuff. And hey, if you have playlists that you've created that you'd like to share, I'd love to hear what you're listening to. So tweet me at @TheTrickness and send me a link to your Spotify playlist. I'm always on the lookout for new music, especially stuff that's kind of a little off the beaten track and maybe a little electronic in nature. But hey, I'll listen to anything. So yeah, send me your playlist links. My guest on the show for this episode certainly knows a lot about playlists. His name is Justin Barker, and he's the founder-director of Slice Music Limited, a UK-based streaming and content consultancy. He's also the director of streaming strategy, global artist and label services for PIAS, and previously held curational and operational digital roles at Universal Music Group dating back to 2006. Justin has been riding the edge of the streaming music wave for a decade and has unique perspective on the history and evolution of the streaming music space. After more than 15 years of destruction and decline in the music business, there's a glimmer of hope again. Even as physical product and digital download sales continue to wither, the explosive popularity of streaming music services like Spotify and Apple Music have brought back growth to an industry that's been shrinking for so long it almost forgot the meaning of the word. On-demand streaming subscription services have been around for a long time. Rhapsody launched way back in 2002, and the current king of the mountain, Spotify, launched in 2008. It's really hard to survive being a standalone music service, and many players have either shut down or been acquired and absorbed into other entities. Spotify themselves have over 40 million paying customers, but lost $200 million on revenues of $2 billion in 2015. Despite the challenges in the space, new services are being introduced by Amazon and iHeartRadio, and even Pandora is offering an expanded pay service. Each of these services must find a way to differentiate themselves from the other players in the space to win the favor of potential new subscribers and even keep their existing ones. But they're not just competing with each other, they're competing with YouTube, which is arguably the world's biggest streaming music service. And let's not forget that YouTube is free. How content is promoted and consumed on Spotify is evolving at a lightning pace. Adapting to these ongoing changes has proven challenging for many artists and labels. So Justin's here to kick around some history with us and shine a light into the mists. Welcome to the show, Justin Barker.
Hi.
Airplay and video play used to be the means to an end, and that end was a record sale or maybe a download in the past decade or so. Now the streaming play itself is the end. So I wanted to start talking to you about the means to that end.
Right.
Firstly, could you just tell us a little bit about what your company does, what you actually do, what the company's about?
So, I mean, these days I operate it more on the side of like my day job. Essentially it's a strategic consultancy that specifies in streaming media. I'd say that with particular focus on Spotify and YouTube, because to my mind those are the principal platforms. And certainly the ones where, you know, you can actually do things. I mean, I don't want to diminish the achievements of Apple Music in the last year. I think it's great to have another credible party at the table, but it is kind of a closed shop. And because it's only been around a year, the ecosystem isn't quite as fleshed out as maybe the other two are. So there's kind of a limited amount of input that I can typically put into that service. And I do also do some professional curation work as well on the site. Those are kind of the two things that I have to kind of limit myself to at the minute. I formerly did do quite a bit of influencer outreach marketing with Slice, but it's very bitty work and it's very time-consuming, and it's very difficult to juggle that with a suite of responsibilities at a full-time gig.
So you helped get Universal's playlist brand Digster get started in the UK. And
that's right, in the UK, yeah.
And you had seemingly great success with that before Spotify shifted their focus and started getting more into their own curated playlists, which now account for probably 90% of the playlist listening on the service, right?
If not more than that, yeah.
So can you talk about the dynamic of the before and after, when how the shift was, how it manifested itself, and what the impact has been since that changeover happened and they've started kind of pushing their own playlists?
Sure. So, I mean, I think there's a line, I think, in the streaming world that I like to draw from like 2013 is that line. So there was a time before that, and there was a time after that, and actually that doesn't just apply to Spotify. I think that you can follow a lot of changes, albeit different ones, on YouTube that happened during and after that year. And I think both services prior to 2013 looked pretty different to what they looked like after. And that year seems to have been not exactly a year zero for both, but certainly a pretty epochal change of both platforms. For Spotify specifically, I mean, I remember when they first came into the Universal UK offices in 2008, and the product was great in a sense, but it was pretty limited, and it was it copped a lot of flack for being this at various points as well from some pretty illustrious names in the industry. It was kind of like a search box that you searched for what you wanted to listen to, and not with the full catalogs either. There was only a certain amount of catalog that was licensed to Spotify in those very early days. But I suppose by 2012, maybe even 2011, it had achieved a stage of maturity where I'd say the lion's share of content was pretty much available. I mean, certainly major label content anyway. I mean, I think there might have been a few independent labels still holding out for fairly legitimate fears about cannibalization of revenues in other areas. But it was still very much like a service built for serious music fans that knew what they were looking for. And I suppose that was why it had so much criticism from certain corners of the industry, that it wasn't really helping you very much with your search for music. You kind of had to know what you wanted already. But what it did have was some pretty cool social features, which I guess it was amongst the first to do. I mean, Deezer had similar ones, and I think audio was probably, when it was still a going concern, probably best in class in social. But the point was that you could develop audiences around the playlists that you created, and you could get followers to your profile. And that was, kind of the policy of Spotify in those days. They wanted to allow their community to create and curate playlists that other people followed. And then there were some, platform iterations that happened that helped surface those. So the app finder in Spotify was one of those, one of their first forays into that. And the Discover page, which is, I think, still in Browse, but sort of a little bit buried on one of the tabs on the homepage. And the Discover tab in those days was there to surface tracks, albums, playlists, even comments, I think, at some point. And it allowed a community of independent playlisters to grow and develop followings. And up until 2013, the line, as I remember it from Spotify, was, because we used to ask them, what are your plans in this space? And I mean, I think in those days, Universal and Sony, and especially those two really, had developed their own playlist brands. The initiatives have obviously, in both cases, begun out of the Nordics, where Spotify was strongest and at its biggest stage of maturity. And I think in those days, when we were asking Spotify those questions, we were really more sort of angling for placement of our own playlists and how could we get those in front of more people. And the line we always got from them was, we're not really thinking about that. We just want to empower our talented community members to create followings, and we're happy with that. So in that landscape, it was a lot easier to grow followings. You didn't have such aggressive promotion of stuff on the homepage, and it was a little bit more of a free-for-all, if you like. But obviously, being the representative of a major company, you had a lot more freedom than most would. So I think that was the environment at which I was working. I first started working on the Digster brand in the UK, and under which I was able to grow its following pretty organically. I mean, it was a very kind of experimental project in the UK at the time. That Spotify was still something of an unknown quantity. We didn't really know it was going to take off in the UK like it did in the Nordics. I mean, we thought it probably would, but it was still, there was an element of doubt.
So were you at that time, when you were creating playlists, were you curating yourself and doing kind of A&R on Universal's catalog and saying, let me put together a British indie rock compilation, or was it more lifestyle oriented, or was it more, what was the dynamic of what you were creating? What kind of playlist?
We kind of I had quite a lot of license to do whatever I wanted to do in those days. I mean, it was kind of an experimental thing, and I think it's a healthy environment when you're trying to create something new and that doesn't have too many precedents, to not be too overburdened with expectations in the initial phase, so that you can kind of try things and see what works. I think that the main things that I was working on right at the beginning were, obviously a kind of pop theme playlist, because that is a lot of the Universal catalog. I developed a new music playlist, which subsequently we rebranded a few years later to the Hype New Music thing on the UK profile, which was more for development acts and kind of cooler bloggy stuff. And then some other genre playlists, and then some fun things which I thought were, I was definitely interested in them, and where Universal had a lot of catalog in those spaces. So Universal has a terrific urban catalog, and I think one of the more, I don't know if we call them left field, but like certainly the less obvious things that I was building at the time were these produced by playlists, the focus on producers.
Right.
So I was doing things like Kanye and like the stuff he produced for other people, not his own stuff, and Pharrell and Neptunes and Dr. Dre, and like basically I choose producers where I knew that Universal had a significant amount of their produced repertoire, because that was always at the heart of what I was doing in those days. I was very mindful of the fact that I had this responsibility developing this brand to promote Universal's artists, and so I always had to choose the genres. I always felt I had to choose the genres that fitted best with the catalog that we had.
Were you sprinkling in any repertoire from any other of the majors, or was it Universal specific, all of it?
Yeah, I was. I felt they had to be credible, because the space was, even at that point, relatively competitive. And you were dealing, I think, with an early adopter audience that is a bit more picky about that sort of thing. Like they want to have one stop to go to and for it to be credible. And I think whenever you're building any brand, at the initial phase, it's got to be pretty credible. So I kind of felt that a sort of 70-30 split was about the maximum third-party content that I was happy to put in there. I felt that Universal's repertoire was really strong, and we didn't really need to stoop below that. And I felt also that if we did go below that, it wasn't really doing its job, because it just, you could have a session where someone was listening to your playlist where they wouldn't hear any Universal content. So, I always felt that the function of those playlist brands was to promote and facilitate discovery of Universal repertoire. So I felt that was about like I said, the maximum third-party content. I mean, there were certain genres that it wasn't even that. I mean, like the urban genres, like hip-hop, for example, we didn't even need to stick to that. There was such strength in depth in the roster that we pretty much more than could cope with without that sort of percentage of third-party content.
So in this pre-awakening of Spotify playlists world, how did you go about marketing the playlist that you had created on behalf of Universal to people? Did you do it external to the service, or was it did you just build a home and hope that people would find the content. How did you draw attention to the playlists that you had created?
Well, I think that the app finder did us a huge amount of favors in those early days, because I think when that first launched, well, the Digster app, which was developed principally out of Sweden, but like the UK being a major territory, as well as the US, like we all had quite a lot of input into how that was built and what it needed to do. And because I think it was maybe in the second phase of apps, it sort of had quite a prominent placement within the desktop version of Spotify, at least, because there just weren't that many apps. I mean, there were probably, 20 at that point, maybe. So I kind of felt that in that early phase, as long as you could build product that was good, people would find it. But in addition to that, like, we ran social media profiles to help out off platform, and we try and get buy-in from artist accounts where possible, although I have to admit that didn't come until we sort of attained a decent enough following for them to really care about it.
Yeah.
And you could tag the playlists sensibly. In those days, you couldn't. You had to get Spotify to brand the playlists for you. Like, you didn't have that. At the moment, when you do that and you have a verified profile, you can add a description and you can add an image. But in those days, Spotify had to do it for you. But there was a way, and I think they kind of shut this down, although I'm not entirely sure it doesn't work anymore. But you could add a lot of like tags to the invisible part of the description, which you'd see quite a lot of followers come through from search from that. So it was a very basic search engine that Spotify had, but you could still do a little bit of SEO to increase your follower counts.
So then, roundabout in 2013, this big shift came. Do you remember, or did you have any perspective on what made them wake up and realize that this is something that was going to be a value add, or something that was important to their users, to where they needed to get really aggressive and start marketing their own curated playlist?
My best theory, and it is that, it is really that, I spoke a bit earlier about them copping quite a lot of flack for being just a search box. I think it was Jimmy Iovine that really said that quite a lot of times in the press about what they were doing. And I think there was a certain pressure on them, externally to solve that problem. And they experimented with a bunch of other things, and I guess they felt from the data that they had, which was way better than anything that we ever could see, that the initiatives that they tried weren't really working. I think they maybe even had quite a high user churn rate in those days as well. So I think that they realized that as their audience got a bit less muso-y and a bit less picky about what they were listening to, as you would hope it would, well, not hope it would, but as you would imagine it would when the platform achieved a certain scale in its user base, that they needed something a bit more immediate for people to understand what it exactly was that they were signing up for. Because you have to remember that, Spotify's only been around really as a public concern since 2008. So this is 5 years in, and it's still a pretty new thing. And I think it's well established that, Apple Music played quite a big role in educating people about what streaming even was. So I think that it was more of a bid to provide a more welcoming environment for new users, and as a kind of a customer retention tool. That's as best theory as that I can imagine. And also, I guess there's an element of proving that it can do things, and as much to investors as anything else, like, we can push this artist, we can make this happen, we can, break an act. I think that was part of the objective as well.
Well, and I guess that gets labels and artists a lot more invested in the service, because then that's actively trying to develop artists, as opposed to just sitting there waiting for somebody who may have already heard something to say, I want to hear this, right? Because that was the criticism about a search box, is that you had to kind of know what you wanted to hear, and it was a very much a lean-in experience, and I think Spotify's gotten a lot better at lean back in the past few years. Would that be a fair comment?
I think that's fair. I think that's pretty much what I was getting at.
So can you explain now, like, because you are kind of uniquely positioned to kind of comment on this, but what is the current process for working a track to Spotify to get added to one of their playlists? And how does a label, or how does a curator who's bringing a piece of content to Spotify determine which playlist to target and what is the process for lobbying Spotify to try to get that track on that playlist?
Well, I think these days that's quite a difficult problem for people to solve. So I think that Spotify are very good at proactively looking for stuff. I should say that straight away. We're looking at a situation now where they have pretty developed editorial teams in the major markets. Those are usually like quite a few people involved and with certain genre specialists. And I think you have to imagine that the kind of people that end up doing jobs like that are, colossal music fans that, want to find their own stuff anyway. And they'll have their own personal points of reference like any music fan would. And I think finding out what those are and making sure that you're getting featured on those blogs or, those YouTube channels or like whatever it is they're looking at is an important first step that, anyone, whether they're signed or not, can do. But I think that if you're looking at pitching them directly, as you would do for a major or a larger indie or anyone that has a relationship with Spotify in general. Sometimes it's management too. Spotify have some pretty good relations with a lot of managers. It's really about giving them reasons to feature you. I mean, those reasons could be like it's just a really strong track, and there are certainly precedents on Spotify for them just championing things that they like. But I think typically our understanding is when we go in and pitch artists is that we want to be pitching them stuff that we think is more likely to get featured, so there's a certain amount of understanding about the type of playlists that they have and the type of playlists that are popular. But also, like many, much like radio, really, at least in the UK, you have to kind of go armed with a whole bunch of success metrics. So they want to see that something's happening around an artist and that it's ready to be championed by them, I guess.
I had a previous episode of the podcast with a guy named Sandy Smallins who had been at Spotify over a bunch of years dealing with original content and artist relations. And Sandy said we had this conversation about really hardcore music fans, and the kind of thrust of the conversation was that maybe real hardcore music fans and delivering an experience to a really hardcore music fan akin to a college radio show or really good indie retailer isn't really scalable in a service like Spotify. And that perhaps where the sweet spot is for them being successful is not really hardcore music fans, but it's just the general public, which leads to, and casual music fans, let's say, which kind of leads to the growth of mood and lifestyle playlists. Do you think that because of the rise of these kind of mood and genre-based playlists that the hardcore music fan is becoming less relevant in the streaming world at all?
That's a tricky question to answer. My theory is that in the past we had maybe, or people in general had a somewhat inflated idea of how many people were interested in like more hardcore things. My theory is that in the days before online follower numbers were all public and play counts were public, you saw an act on the front cover of the NME, or you saw them with a Best New Music album on Pitchfork. You kind of had the idea that these acts were quite big, and especially because there was direct consequences of things like that. I mean, like in the retail world or in the physical world, if your record got like a 9 out of 10 in Pitchfork, then that meant it was going to get stocked in every independent record store. It was going to get, prominently shelved in those stores, and it would guarantee you a certain amount of sales. So, you ended up having these kind of metrics that fed back to everyone else. But I think now what's really difficult is that, let's say the same thing happens and you have a sort of left field act that has a really good review or like a lot of support editorially from those kind of established publications or sites, and then you as a fan and you look at it and then you go to the profile on Spotify and you see that their biggest song has like 50,000 plays, and I'm sure that there's a mindset that goes 50,000 plays, that's nothing. I mean, do I need to listen to this? And I think that makes it very difficult to grow audiences. I mean, I had this conversation with some friends who are social media managers, and they are all of the opinion that numbers matter for the public as well. Like it's something that I should be paying attention to this now because loads of other people are paying attention to it. And whilst that doesn't really apply to the early adopter audience who maybe even have the opposite mindset, when you start to scale it beyond that to your sort of early followers or late followers or mainstream audiences, I think that's when they do start noticing those things. So I think that's one problem with the scaling. And maybe it doesn't make sense for a service like Spotify, who have to cater to the biggest amount of their user base with their editorial. And I get that. I totally understand that audience is becoming increasingly casual. In fact, I think it's a stated aim from Daniel Ek for years, like when Spotify were first given the tag of retail disruptor, and I think he was quite quick to sort of say, no, I'm not really interested in retail. That doesn't work for my business. I'm interested in radio because that earns way more than the recorded music business, and there are far more people, and my model is a scale model which works as a revenue generator when we have hundreds of millions of users. And I think that in order to hit that kind of number, you can't focus on retail.
I mean, it's an interesting question. Like you said, it's a complicated question because I think there have always been those small numbers, and those hardcore music fans have kind of tended to be tastemakers and indicators of what might happen later with a band. If there were 50,000 people listening to something, it was who are those 30,000 people? And if they are key influencers, those 30,000 people, if they're going to go out and proselytize and talk about the record, then that might end up building it into a million-selling act. And where are those people listening? If they're listening in an area where, in a college area, and that they're going to be able to kind of get some viral action happening around a record, then they might be a really important 50,000 listeners. Is there anything algorithmically, or is anyone thinking about not just the pure number, but actually who and where these listens are coming from, and how that might indicate growth or success for an act, over time?
I mean, it's certainly something that I try to think about quite a lot. It's just difficult to find out who they are because it's just not. It's
not in the dashboard. It's Spotify. It doesn't tell you, right? So I mean, that's
one reason why they have to protect the data of their users.
Yeah.
So you can't really see that. They can probably see it. I mean, I wouldn't want to comment on what they do with that, but I mean, you can observe certain things. I've done some analysis recently on the Fresh Finds playlist. Again, like from the outside, and Fresh Finds, you know what that's about, right? Like it's a playlist that is designed to surface undiscovered talent. I mean, usually new stuff. So it gets refreshed every week, and it's about a 30-track playlist. It has 370,000 followers, and it's kind of like what you call, I guess, a cyborg playlist. In that, as best I understand it, Spotify have a technology that basically crawl hundreds of blogs looking for artist mentions and maybe some positive sentiment analysis and some engagement on those blogs, and they kind of form like a long list of artists, and then they cross-reference it against what a group of their most early adopter listeners, I think it's about 50,000, what they listen to and what they add to playlists. And then they filter that down to a list of a few hundred. The algorithm does that. And then it gets passed to their editorial guys, and then their editorial guys chop it up into the different, because Fresh Finds, there are actually 5 or 6 of them, I think, 5 maybe, that are 4 genre specific, and 1 that's like the general new music stuff, which is a sort of mixture of what's in the other ones.
Yeah.
And then the human team will decide which one of the genre playlists these tracks go in, and which ones go in the main one, and the order of the playlist, and that kind of stuff. And what you tend to see quite commonly is that gets refreshed on Wednesdays, and then on Thursday or throughout the rest of the week, you'll see a lot of these tracks crop up in the global viral 50, of which there are another sort of small set of playlists that are programmed off the back of, be it algorithmically, or maybe it's actually human curated. I don't know how they do that, but there's definitely a very clear correlation with what goes on Fresh Finds and what goes on viral, a few days after. And I think it's reasonable to theorize that those kind of playlists, the discovery playlists, are ones that Spotify tests stuff with. They want to see what the traction is on these songs, and maybe that's even surfacing tracks that just their editors like as well. And then if something's really connected well on both of those playlists, then it might see some really good support elsewhere in the more straight up human curated playlists. And that's kind of one route to build things on the platform.
I guess it's a way to build things on the platform without having a relationship necessarily within Spotify where you can bring them and work them on adding your record to the service. Like if there are good mentions on social, if people are talking about you, if you've got things happening, good blog reviews, good live show reviews, you might actually get featured in something even though you don't have a record label walking it in the door for you.
Yeah, totally. And I think it's often a discovery tool for labels as well. Those kind of artists when they crop up on a Fresh Finds playlist.
In terms of algorithmic versus human curation, do you foresee a sweet spot in terms of the mix of algorithmic versus human curation in streaming services, like the percentage? In other words, we see things like Discover Music Weekly and Spotify, which is getting better all the time and is getting a tremendous amount of listens. Do you think that as these services grow more intelligent, that human curation is going to remain relevant, or do you think it's going to be encompassed by the algorithmic curation? Like, what are your feelings on all that stuff?
My feeling is that the human curation is the detailing. And so if we use the analogy of a sculpture, you've got a big block of stone, and maybe you want to make a sculpture which is, I don't know, a meter tall, even, and you've got this big rock that's, I don't know, 3 meters. So, for the first bit of that, you're going to want some heavy-duty tools to knock it down to something that you can work with, to save you chiseling the whole thing down. And then when you've got it to a sort of size where it's, manageable to do it manually, then you start doing it yourself, and that's where the art of it happens. I think that's my read on it. So,
in other words, the human aspect of the art is the human part of it, right?
Yeah, I think the algorithms, I mean, they get better all the time, I have to say that. To my mind, they've always done the heavy lifting, and then you want the human to come in for the quality control at the end of it. I mean, although I have to say it totally depends on on a couple of things, like the audience who you're pushing the playlist at. So I think if you're pushing, and I think I said this on my Meet-em panel, like if you're targeting a playlist which is like a top 40 playlist with the biggest pop tracks, well, you don't need a human to do that, really. You just look at an algorithm can quite capably do like what's popular on the service. And for most people, like the casual audience that probably just fire up Spotify, whack on today's top hits, hit shuffle, and they're happy with that, which is I think actually quite a lot of people. I mean, today's top hits has like over 10 million followers, which is 10% of Spotify. I think for those kind of things, it's fine, does the job pretty well. It starts to get more complicated when you've got more demanding users that are going to want something a bit more than that. And then it's also a little bit about how good your data is, because that has to be of a certain base quality for an algorithm to do its job well. The algorithms have to be programmed intelligently as well. I mean, I think Spotify were way ahead of the pack on that front when they bought the Echo Nest, because they were buying like an incredible amount of user data and music data, and that's, I think, and personnel as well, really talented programmers and data scientists who really have formed the backbone of a lot of their algorithmic initiatives. Certainly Discover Weekly. Is it better? I mean, I don't know.
I think it's better than when it first started. I've definitely found some stuff in it that has appealed to me, and I have very bizarre taste in music where it's serving up. I mean, obviously, it's just me anecdotally, but I think it's getting smarter. I think it's getting better. I think it's probably, in terms of personalized algorithmic playlisting, is probably the reference standard out there now. Would that be a fair comment?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I know that there is a certain amount of contextual data weighting to the Discover Weekly algorithm, but I kind of feel that the problem with it is that internet music has always, it really fragmented the market quite a lot. I think that's both not necessarily a bad thing, but just a fact that with all this access to all this new music, people's tastes just got a lot broader, and you had a lot more micro niches develop within fan bases. And I think the slight problem, like the only real issue I have with Discover Weekly, which is, I don't want to criticize it. I think it's a great product, and as a customer retention tool, it's phenomenal. But it does kind of individualize everything a little bit too much in a way. Like, if you and me were going to have a conversation about music, 10 years ago, we'd have had certain reference points of stuff that we both came across. We might have read the same websites or whatever, or, had friends with similar tastes. And now if we were going to have a conversation about, like, what's in my Discover Weekly playlist, I'd be like, oh, have you heard this track? And you'd be like, no. Have you heard this track? And I'd be like, no. And we'd have that conversation probably throughout the whole playlist. And you'd probably have it with most people. So it almost becomes something that's almost not really shareable with people. And I think that the knock-on effect of that, and this is one of the things that worries me, not a little about the current setup of music, is that when I look at the rest of the web, and my knowledge is not exhaustive, maybe I'm just missing a trick here, but it feels to me that there isn't as much conversation around music in the way that there was 10 years ago even. Whenever I see like big conversations around music, it tends to be around pop stars or like, name artists.
Absolutely, yeah.
And you don't really see those kind of conversations happening around the developing acts. And I think if you don't have those conversations and that social importance, that's a real problem for developing artists.
You talked a little bit about incentivizing influencers in a interview that I had read that you had done online, and talking about third-party curators having an incentive to participate and bring their intellect into streaming services. Could you get into that a little bit about your feelings on that?
Yeah, I mean, where to go with this? So there's two ways that I want to answer this question. Like, I definitely want to pick up that issue around the social, but let's park that for a minute. Remind me if I forget.
All right.
Because that's one of the bigger issues, I think, for independent voices. Yeah, I mean, there are ways around it. So I think what I would have been talking about was probably like the bigger, who I like to think of as like the new curators, and I guess they have like much more of a youth audience. So maybe sort of sub 28, maybe sub 25 audience, and there's a whole thriving community of curators for music on YouTube. And some of them have some pretty epic followings. So I'll go to the top of the tree here because there's a YouTube promo channel, curator channel. So just to be clear about what that is, it's when you upload an audio track to YouTube with an artworked image, which is consistent with like the branding of the channel, and then that video gets pushed to your subscribers to the channel. It's a very increasingly prominent form of music discovery. So the top channel in that category is Trap Nation, which has like over 9 million subscribers. I think it adds like 24,000 a day, and it does about 8 or 9 million views across the channel a day. And most remarkably, when I looked at the top most viewed channels on YouTube, because there's a chart that's published for that, last week, or maybe it was the week before, I saw that Trap Nation is now the 23rd most viewed channel on YouTube, which is incredible. When you're looking at that, like those kind of streaming volumes, you've got a huge audience, which you monetize because the agreements that they will have at a channel at that scale with labels will be, we monetize these videos and you get the promotional value out of it. That used to be the exchange. And the promotional value of getting your track in front of 9 million targeted fans is pretty big. So, I think it ultimately, whilst other people might disagree with this, I think it's kind of a fair exchange. The channel owner on YouTube makes a lot of money off those views, especially when you're at the position when you're doing like 60 million views a week. You're earning a lot of money from YouTube, even with them taking 45% of your revenues. Those channels at that sort of scale are all part of networks. They're monetized properly. Targeted ads run around them. It's quite a lot of money. And suddenly you're saying to these channels like, oh, do it on Spotify as well, and where you don't make any money. And it's a lot of extra work. It can kind of siphon the views away from your YouTube videos, so maybe there's an opportunity cost of doing it as well. So there aren't really they haven't traditionally been the incentives for them to migrate that audience to another platform. But I'd say it really began this year, the sort of penny drops on a lot of those channel owners that you get paid like, I don't know, 6 times more for a stream on Spotify than you do on YouTube. And Spotify is a platform that people listen to more stuff on. And the fundamentals of that, I think, are really just down to logistics. So if you look at both platforms, you look at 60% of the usage for both YouTube and for Spotify coming from mobile devices. And I don't know if you've ever tried to listen to music on YouTube on a mobile phone, but
yeah, it's not.
Unless you're a Red subscriber, which is just the States and Australia at the minute, you can't do anything else with your phone while you're listening to that.
Yeah.
So that just engenders fewer plays. And I think that most people that have Spotify that are fans of those YouTube channels really want it to be on Spotify because it's a much more convenient listening experience for them. And so a lot of these channels realized these things, and they're like, hey, hold on a minute, like our fans have Spotify and they want to listen to it on Spotify, and if we owned the tracks, we would get paid 6 times more for the streams on Spotify than we do on YouTube. So consequently, they started signing tracks. And that's really the only way that you can make that model work.
Well, and then I guess
you've got to be a rights holder to make money out of curation on Spotify.
If Spotify is not going to pay somebody like Trap Nation to come over because they're not rights holders and bring their audience over and make it resident in Spotify, then the question is, if you want to bring those audiences over and move them over to Spotify, again, it gets back to the question: what is the incentive for them moving from YouTube, a place where they are making money, to Spotify, where a place where they're not going to make money unless they're a rights holder? Because it's not like Spotify has lots of extra margin that they can give to companies to bring them over. Yeah,
they don't.
So,
I mean, I think that this is a fairly equitable solution to that. Like, you have to remember that there is an enormous surplus of music being made. I mean, there are about 10,000 releases on Spotify every week, and the amount that gets uploaded to SoundCloud and YouTube, I wouldn't even like to guess at. And so a lot of these guys, because they, Trap Nation, I mean, they do like trap music, they do like EDM trap music, and that's a certain category, and it's a very hot category right now, so there's a lot of kids making that kind of music. The idea of being signed to like their favorite channel is just as prestigious as, being signed to, a label back in the day would have been. So I don't think they're short of talented musicians making music to put on the channels. And when you've got that, people submitting stuff all the time. I mean, I remember chatting to another one of the channel owners, and he was telling me that they get like thousands of track submissions a week just to be featured on the channel, never mind being signed. So what I'm saying is that there isn't really a shortage of a route to, these guys are in the position, possibly the best position to hear all these new tracks, and signing them is a fairly logical next step, especially when you have the added benefit of being able to monetize it on all these other platforms.
So accidentally they become the next generation of record labels, I guess.
Oh, well, I think that's the way it's going, yeah.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. What are some just pointers on ways that independent artists and small indies can grow their own playlists and grow listens on Spotify?
I think that I don't know how to start to answer this question.
Easy question, right?
Yeah, right. Well, definitely having some presence elsewhere online as a base to funnel people into. I think that's a good start. I mean, I'm going to point you back to that YouTube example again because it's just such an obvious correlatory thing for me. I mean, I've seen so much in the industry press about, YouTube is killing Spotify's premium tier and it's stealing audience away from them. And I'm just like, that's not how that works at all. I'm really sure that's not how it works. Because from what I can see, and I have one of my clients is they run a lot of these promo channels, And all we really see is like a pretty symbiotic relationship between these two platforms. I mean, I kind of hinted at it earlier with the user experience of both. I think YouTube is an excellent wide end of a funnel for you to be able to push people to Spotify. And it's also a platform with really developed social features and a big community around it. And I wanted to pick up this social point on Spotify because I really don't understand. Well, I don't really understand why. I understand why they want to have their own editorial, and I understand why they want to give it prominence. But I don't really understand why they've kind of made it so difficult for anyone else to get in the game. Because it's kind of the opposite on YouTube. Like YouTube has always had like a really hands-off approach to, content. Really, I mean they'll sort of surface it when it's doing well on one of the sort of hashtag channels, like the hashtag music channel will feature some of the curated channels now and again. But it's really down to the individual channel owner to develop their own audience and their own brand and the community around them. And I think that works really well.
Well, it's a free service, though. I mean, that's one thing. I mean, there's a lot of stuff on YouTube that's great, and there's a lot of stuff that's not great. But you can't really complain about it if it's free. If you're paying $10 a month, I guess that maybe. Do you think that that's at all part of the reason why they want to have such control over it, so that they can manage the experience, almost like Apple does with everything they do?
Well, hey, I'm not criticizing them for having their own stuff and pushing that to their sort of casual users, but it seems that there was like a much better tool set for other voices to, and that applies to labels as well. I mean, that's not just completely independent people. I think it applies to major labels. And I've always found it very frustrating when I was doing Digster that we had such limited means to communicate with this fan base that we'd cultivated on the platform. I don't really understand why that's not an option. I mean, to me, to my mind, the social features of Spotify were really what was a big differentiator for it in the first phase, when it was starting to attain its market dominance. And whilst I totally get that they need to have, as we said, that welcoming experience for new users and for casuals, I would like it if there was, there were more tools available for other voices that maybe do something different, to do things on their platform. And I see that happening all the time on YouTube. And I'm not sure that's quite answered the question, but the point is that I think that YouTube is a great funnel for everything into Spotify, and I think no one should forget just how big a platform it actually is as well, because we're the last publicly quoted monthly active user figures for YouTube were 3 years ago, when the internet had 600 million fewer people on it, and it was 1 billion then. So our best estimates are now that it must be pushing 1.5 billion monthly active users. To put that into context, there's 3 billion people online. 25% of the internet's China, where there's no YouTube. So you're really looking at a platform that 2/3 of the internet visit at least on a monthly basis.
Oh, and for sure. But I mean, I think everybody understands the size of it, or people in the industry.
I don't think they do. I don't think they understand the perspective of it.
I think they do. I think the thing is that there's maybe a fear, or to put a positive light on it, a hope that if the revenue gets to a better place with it, because it's such a huge thing, because it's such a dominant thing, and because it could potentially be impeding the growth of paid services because it's so great and it's free, that people just want to extract more money for their content from the music industry. Yeah, but that's a separate argument. I mean, I absolutely don't think that it for me, what stifles the growth of the premium services and the growth of and the stability of the other established revenue models, it's not YouTube. It's the point at which, sadly, the industry lost control of the supply of the product that it sells, and when you've got that, it's tough to make a business out of it. And I think everyone in the industry deserves a huge round of applause for
for making that work. And but I think that's what the base reality is. And I think when you have a lot of those, especially kids who've, we think about when this all started, and it all started when, with Napster, and that was 17 years ago.
Yeah.
And if you're a 17-year-old kid now, like, you literally have never known a reality where that was different. And I mean, I always felt when Spotify first came into Universal, there was obviously quite a lot of excitement and worry about it as a service, because on the one hand, it risked cannibalizing a fairly decent business, but on the other hand, those of us that worked on the cutting edge of digital were just seeing our revenues just destroyed by piracy, left, right, and center. And we were legitimately worried whether people would ever we'd ever make any money from this.
Yeah.
And Spotify was like, oh, well, yeah, this is a business model that works, and hopefully is sustainable, and we can make something here. And I think that that's the case with all of these streaming platforms. And I think with YouTube it's slightly more complicated because, as you say, it's an ad-funded business, and I think that
and it's not a pure music service either. There's a lot of content
sure.
not just music. Yeah.
But I think a lot of the problem in the money aspect of it is, well, twofold really. Like, one, I think it's a lack of the maturity of the online video advertising market. I mean, every year we read these articles about more and more advertisers taking their TV budgets and putting it onto YouTube, especially for anything targeted at under 25s. But that's still not everything. I mean, it's still quite a small. The budgets for TV is still a whole lot bigger than they are for YouTube. And I think until that market has, something comparable in terms of like your CPMs of TV, it's going to be tough for that to really match it, like the old models. But I'm sure that's coming. And I think there've been several studies recently. I'm pretty sure I read it on the Media Music blog a couple of months ago, saying that actually when you break it down, if you just look at the US market, which is a much more mature market for video advertising on YouTube, you'll find that the per play rate on YouTube is actually kind of the same as the free service of Spotify. So not the premium service. I mean, there's never, I don't think the advertising model is ever going to bring in the sort of money that a premium service does, the subscription service does, but it is growing in markets. I think that there's also a slight element of education that needs to happen about how you make money on YouTube. I mean, beyond just from the ads, like how much content you need to put up there to compete with like the vloggers and like the native YouTubers who have multiple videos per week, maybe like in some cases a couple a day, and you're getting paid on watch time on YouTube. So you've got to keep people watching all this content. And that, I think that the other thing for the music industry is that, we think of our core product, and rightly so, as the music, as the songs itself. But the products, if you like, on YouTube, the videos, don't necessarily have to be music.
Yeah.
They can be a whole lot of related to music content, which is all monetized.
Well, and the music can be used as a bed for other video content, or just sliced and diced, and it's a different product category. But I think the hope, I guess, if there's a free tier, but that there's a paid tier that they can graduate to that extracts as much value for the content providers as Spotify does, then that's what the hope is. I guess unfortunately it's just not there yet, and I don't know if it'll ever be there for YouTube. But
well, I mean, let's see how I haven't really seen any numbers on how well Red's doing for them, but I mean, you guys already have that. I mean, that is a $9.99 subscription service, and with a separate dedicated music app, which hopefully will develop into something.
The funny thing is that in a way, Red they must know how Spotify feels to a degree, because when you've got something that's so good that costs nothing, you've got to make a really strong argument for why you should pay for something. And I don't think with Red that they've made the case yet, not even close. But I want to ask you one last question. If you could recreate the music business right now in any way you wanted to, just from scratch, what would it look like?
Well, I think that I'd want to go. I mean, one of my clients, this is kind of their staple, but the reason I really like working with them is because this is exactly how I think you should do, ideally, a music company in this current reality. And they go with this sort of full stack music approach. I felt for a long time that one of the biggest problems with the music industry in general is the architecture of it, because it's an old industry that's grown up over 100 years or more, but it's all siloed into different areas. So even in a traditional setup, you've got one company does your live, you have your other company that does your publishing, another company does your records, maybe another one does your merch. Sometimes they're aligned, sometimes they're not, and I really feel like if you were going to do something from scratch now, you'd try to have as many of those rights as you could have, so that you could leverage one against the other, and you could build a business that worked in this new environment.
Great answer. And last question, but very important one, especially for someone who's spent so much of their life in curation. What record should people go out and listen to right now?
Oh, that's a horrible question. Okay, no, but I've got a great answer, and it's nothing to do with my work. I just think this guy's amazing. His second solo album came out. It's the first solo album in 5 years, so I'm pretty excited about it. He's an American-Chilean electronic musician called Nicholas Shah. He's absolutely incredible, and his new album, Sirens, is a masterpiece, and really the kind of record that, I said to one of my colleagues today that I feel like people don't really make anymore. So that actually was a lot easier an answer than I thought it would be.
I'm so happy that you recommended Nicholas Jar, because I loved Pomegranates and Dark Side, and I've got a bunch of his 12s, the Nymphs 12s that he put out. I have it saved in my Spotify saved library.
What are you doing talking to me? Like, put the phone down and put that record on.
Truthfully, the reason why I haven't listened to it yet, and this is going to sound so weird, but I ordered a vinyl copy from Boomcat or Bleep. I interchangeably order stuff from those guys, and I like to have the first listen be Dropping the Needle, and it hasn't come yet. So I'm like literally waiting for the LP to come, and then I'll put it on the deck, and then when I go out, I'll listen to it in a streaming service. But I want to hear it on wax first. So,
okay,
but great recommendation, and I wholeheartedly agree with the guys. The guy's a genius musician. Anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for dropping some Logic with us. I know we talked about this was like a very, very rich meal, and you explained it in such an insightful and articulate way. But it could really be a semester-long college course, just how to navigate your way through this and the history of it and where it's going and all the subtleties. And I sincerely appreciate you coming on the show and giving us your thoughts about all this.
Thanks for having me.
That'll do it for this episode of How to Fix the Music Business. I'd like to thank once again our special guest, Justin Barker of Slice Music. And as a side note to Justin, thank you for tolerating the technical difficulties I had, which did not make it into the edit of the show, but Justin was very patient with nonetheless. And thank you for listening to the show. If you have any comments or questions or just want to recommend some great music, send me a tweet to @TheTrickness, and be sure to visit the website at howtofixthemusicbusiness.com. Thanks a lot. I'm going to go put something on my record player. Hope you are too.